Jesse, the football season is done. We are here for a tier maker to rank how teams went in 2024. That's exactly what we're going to do. Any words before we get into it?
I'm just so excited to sink my teeth into this.
Before we get into the video, if you could leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and comment down below how you thought these teams went this season. Get it in the comments. Let's get into it. So the tiers are exceptional. So let's just chuck Brisbane in there. Let's not flap about here. They got the flag after 20 years of not winning the flag. They were very close to not even being in the grand final. Some crazy finals performances. I was at that prelim, Jesse. They were 4 goals down. Cam Rainer's fourth quarter. Magnificent. Will Ashcroft comes into the side in the back end of the year and was exceptional. One of my favourite players in the league. Have you got anything more to add to the Brisbane Lions' exceptional season?
No, I don't think it's possible to get anything other than exceptional for a flag. I was just thinking while you were talking, would a premier in any game or any season previously ever count as not exceptional? Like, was by the third Richmond premiership, were we thinking, oh, that wasn't their best?
Maybe all 4 of the West Coast ones.
Yeah, true. Disaster.
Other than that, yeah. Who else had an exceptional year other than the Premier, Jesse? Who would you put in that basket?
Hawthorn probably comes to mind. They had zero expectation on this year. Trying to gauge what is a realistic expectation at the start of the year from memory is hard. They came third last year. So I think just improving and avoiding the bottom 4 would have been their kind of goal this year, and everything clicked in a way that nobody saw coming, and perhaps even them. So for them to win a final and at times be one of the form sides of the comp and put big scores on the board, I think they were exceptional. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think they were sort of just expected to maybe push for the top 8 this year. Started 0-5 and then came home with a wet sail. Played some great footy. They were the most exciting team in the league to watch. They're 1 point away from, 1 kick away from being in a prelim. So I'd 100% say exceptional for the Hawks. Let's go to the other end of the scale, Jesse. Who had a disaster of a year? Would you say West Coast had a disaster of a year, or would that be more stinky?
I'd probably go stinky, but I can think of a team for disaster. Do you want to go disaster, or do you want to go talk about West Coast?
Talk about how stinky West Coast are.
That's a tough one because I think most outside expectations probably expected us to do worse than we did. But I thought that, going into this year, maybe those expectations were too low on West Coast. With a better injury run, we should have expected them to improve, and they did. But what didn't improve was some of their worst performances, albeit we didn't lose a game by 100. We lost it by 99. So, yes, we improved, but I would still say stinky overall. We lost our coach at the end of the day, so how positive can you really spin it?
Positives moving forward. A good trade period looms for the Eagles, Jesse. So
I'm not convinced
things are looking up.
We'll see.
Who did you have in mind for disaster?
Well, I mean, I can think of a reason why you could talk any team out of being disaster, but I think you have to say Richmond's season was a disaster. Now, that was largely due to injury, but they did go into this year with a fairly average squad, in my opinion. I predicted them to go third last. An injury crisis meant they finished last. Is it the best thing for their club to get the wooden spoon and attack the draft? Possibly. But in terms of the actual season, I think it's fair to say Richmond had a disastrous season. If you told any Tigers fan at the start of the year that was how it was going to play out, they would have been gutted. Yeah,
and I don't want to just be on the straight and narrow here. We've gone Premier at the top, Richmond at the bottom. I'm looking at these remaining teams, whose season was just maybe had some good results, but it was a disaster. And it's tough because, Adelaide, they were expected to make top 8 this year and they sort of really fell away. Even Sydney had a really great year, but that last game of the year was a disaster. So it is hard to group other clubs. Do you reckon Collingwood's season could be a disaster, going from premiership to not even making finals? It was definitely stinky. But to not even compete in finals this year, I think that's a bit of a disaster. So I'm going to chuck them in disaster. Sorry, Pies fans. It just wasn't that great.
Offer some nuance to that, where I did also put them an F in my own video on this. But I think there was enough there to suggest that Collingwood hasn't completely died. They had a really slow start to the year and then sort of regained some of their best form with a massive winning streak. And they fumbled the bag again. They had another losing streak towards the back end, and ultimately it wasn't enough. But for me, I think it would have been a disaster had they never played their best footy and missed finals, whereas at least we saw enough to think they could be back next year. So for me, maybe 1 tier up.
Yeah, maybe. But I feel like if you had said to a Pies fan, if you don't make finals this year, they'd say that's a disaster. You know what I mean? They wouldn't say, oh, that'd stink. Oh, maybe they would because they got the flag. All right, you've talked me out of it. We'll put the Pies in stinky. As expected, which teams this year did you think just went sort of exactly how you thought?
Probably.
Real.
Yeah.
Real. I reckon. To be fair, with 4 games to go, it would have been an exceptional season if things had have carried on the way that they had throughout the year. But I think like the place that we finished was probably as expected. We weren't expected to make finals by many people at all, except for our own fan base. So I think Freo is fair to say was pretty as expected this year, with scope to improve next season.
I would agree with that. Following that same logic, the team that finished below them, do you think Essendon qualified for as expected? Bearing in mind they did have so much media scrutiny because of some of their worst performances, but I think they moved up the ladder, if I'm not mistaken. They finished higher than I expected, and some of their worst form wasn't as bad as last year. So in a way, they improved, even if the media vibe didn't feel like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, yeah, they played better footy this year.
They did.
That finals hoodoo's always looming. So I actually think they had a year that is as expected, I would say. I wouldn't say very good. I wouldn't say it was really stinky because they played some really good football at points this year. I'm going to chuck them in as expected. That's a good call, Jesse. You got any more disasters? Let's go back to the disaster stations.
I've just noticed one out of the corner of my eye, the Melbourne Football Club. I don't think you can categorise this as anything else. I should have actually said them before Richmond. There's some adversity, but I think with the turmoil that was rumoured to be at the club at the start of the season, we kind of ignored that. They started well. Petrarca's injury really was a catalyst for them falling away, but I think, there's some vulnerabilities before that. They got pumped by West Coast in Perth. I want to say Petrarca might have still been there when Freo belted them. So the wheels were falling off before that, and they finished bottom 5 for a team that's well and truly in the window. So I think that's a disaster if ever there was one.
100%. Yeah, with all the media talk before the season, I sort of backed them in to have another good year. But they're not as far away from it in terms of performance and results as people say they are. They had quite a few close losses to like GWS, Port, Carlton as well. If those scripts are flipped the other way and you did a video on like if those close results were flipped, it could have been a different season for them. However, this season was a disaster. The whole Clary saga, Petrarca getting injured and like seeking a trade possibly at times. It's only been negative tone around the Ds for the last 24 months, to be honest. So I think that is fair. How would you summarise the season of the Gold Coast Suns? Exceptional, very good, as expected, stinky, or disaster?
For me, I'm going to go as expected. I think I've seen, again, another... there's been some media pressure on them. They talk of like easiest fixture ever, new coach Damien Hardwick, how did they fail to improve? But I've been going through my statistics, Druzy, and they're like the second and third youngest team all year in terms of selected.
Yep.
I say second and third because I think one was for age and the other was for experience. The bottom 3 teams were North, Adelaide and Gold Coast, which really shed some light on the fact that Gold Coast's best players, their group, Raul, Anderson, Flanders, Ben King, Mac Andrew now, like these guys are all before their prime. So for them to improve, I think they've improved. They finished 13th. I reckon that's either the same or slightly better. I'm going to say as expected. I don't think the Gold Coast Suns misfired this year.
Yeah, but we look at these teams in as expected right now. Freo, Essendon and Gold Coast have been mediocre for too long.
And no one rated them. They still don't.
Yeah. No, we'll show them this year. No, you won't. Carlton had big expectations coming into this season, Jesse. They played some really good footy at points this year. Looked like premiership favourites at points late. Pretty much up until that second half of the GWS game where things started taking a south turn. Injuries obviously took their toll late in the year. Would you say as expected or very good? Because I feel like after a prelim last year, they were probably expected to, play another prelim.
I think stinky.
Do ya?
Sure. Yeah, 100%. Well, they were admittedly like we sometimes have a bias for the way they end the season. So 12 months ago, they ended the season amazingly, and everyone, because they got to a prelim, to be fair, thought it was a great season. This year, they started the year like in second place halfway through the season, and then fell away. So then you tend to have a bias towards how they finished. So over the stretch of the season, they were okay, but they dropped 3 spots on the ladder, and and in their worst form were really poor, with a big loss to Hawthorn, one of the biggest examples, but I think in the back end of the year, some really shoddy performances. So I won't say disaster. They made finals. They didn't even let out a whimper in that elimination final, really. No, sure, they had a few goals, but it was 60-0. So I'm going to say stinky. I expected more from Carlton.
Yeah, it was probably a backward step when you phrase it like that. Probably a similar season to Freo, though. But I suppose Freo didn't have that expectation from last year. So we'll put him at the front of stinky. That's a big call. I don't mind it at all. We've got Carlton and West Coast in stinky, so I'm one happy boy. The Western Bulldogs, they're a tough one because, again, played some really good footy this year. It was a seesaw season for the Dogs. People were very hot on them to go all the way in finals, and they just got outplayed by the Hawks. No one's in very good yet. Would you say the Dogs had a very good season, or how did you expect them to go?
Sometimes because when I say as expected, maybe I just nailed all my predictions, but I think it's a tough one because I do think people probably, again, inflate expectations on the Bulldogs. They should have played finals this year. They did, but they did lose their first final. So I think had they won a final, it would have been very good. It's certainly not below as expected. I don't think, certainly not stinky. The percentage is 125, which only Sydney had a better percentage. The gap between their best and worst was quite strong, and they do have some young guns firing now. Jamara had his best season, Sam Darcy, and Bont and Triller were fantastic. So, dare I say it, I think as expected. I think if you make the finals and go out in week one, I don't think that's anything very good. I wouldn't say Dogs fans think it was a very good season.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. I'd say a team that had a very good season this year is Geelong. They were written off by everyone. There was a lot made of their midfield group, but in the end of the season, they actually had one of the best midfields in the comp, which is crazy. But yeah, Geelong made a prelim or a kick away from a grand final, started the year 7-0. I wouldn't say it's exceptional because we've probably seen better Geelong sides, but the Cats did have a very good season. That's a safe one. I'll chuck them in there. Let's go to the Adelaide Crows, Jesse. How did you see their season?
So last year, for context, they were a kickoff making the final 8 because Ben Keys' goal was disallowed. So the finals quality side, I think, is fair to suggest going into this year, young group, only to go backwards and finish in the bottom 4. Now, the bottom 4 this year was a weird race where there was a big gap between Adelaide and the bottom 3. But so they were closer to being, with that group above them. It's a tough one. Like I said, I just highlighted they're still one of the youngest teams in the competition. And I think that, that does correlate with how ready teams are for finals. So I don't think it was a disaster. I think if they had a mature team that was in the window, this would have been a disaster. I would say it's a bit stinky when you finish bottom 4. But I wouldn't go any harder than that.
Yeah, I think stinky's fair for the Crows. Terrible start to the year, but they did play some good footy. They beat GWS. They beat Carlton over in Melbourne as well. So they did have some good wins this year, which will hold them in good stead going forward. So we are left with 5 teams. Would you say North Melbourne had a season as expected, or?
I think so.
I think as expected's fine there. They played some really good footy.
They're distantly the youngest team. Again, I'm leaning on these stats a lot, but I think you need to bear that in mind for where to assess these teams. And North had their best season in a lot of ways, I think. The best run of extended good form we've seen from North. In previous years when they've won because they've been good on the day and then been uncompetitive. This time they were competitive for a longer stretch of the season. So I think more positive than negative, but ultimately still, I think it went down to the final day of the year where the wooden spoon was decided. So we'll say as expected.
As expected. I like that. The Sydney Swans had an exceptional year, but a disaster of a grand final day, Jesse. Look, they played great football for the first sort of 3 months of the season, had a bit of a form slump in the middle there, found their feet towards the end of the year, but just sort of on grand final day didn't show up. I suppose they had a very good season though overall. How do you see it?
I think so. This is tough because the tone on Sydney, having got him belted in the grand final, it's hard to, even for their fans, I'm sure, especially for their fans, to look back with satisfaction on that season. I think you have to say very good though. The caveats against exceptional would be not just the grand final performance, but form against Port Adelaide in that game where they lost by 112. That's not just a bad day. That was beyond alarm bells. They, to their credit, they fought back, but got pants in the grand final. So I think very good. You couldn't go above that, in my opinion.
Oh, chuck them up there. How'd you rate St Kilda's season? A top 8 finals side in 2023. Where would you place them on this tier maker?
If you consider that they had a home final last year, they finished 6th and played some good footy. Best backline in the comp 12 months ago, really good defensive brand. I think you'd have to say it was... I'm lingering between disaster and stinky. I think what might save them is that towards the back end of the year, they started playing pretty well. So they beat up on West Coast, but I remember thinking, they look pretty good. And then they beat Essendon convincingly again, still a team that was ahead of them. They beat the Swans, they beat the Cats. They came from behind to beat the Cats. So I think maybe that resurgence at the end of the year might just save them into stinky rather than being a total disaster.
I agree. Yeah, beat Carlton on the last day of the season. They did have some good form towards the end of the year, and I think they'll be looking close to playing finals footy. It wasn't quite a disaster. They weren't as expected, so I think the stinky category is where the Saints shall sit. We have the Port Adelaide Football Club. Now, I feel like Port Adelaide are as expected every year. You know what you're always going to get with Port. They were one game away from the Grandy this year, but they just didn't really fire a shot in that prelim. Although they competed well, but they just never looked like they were going to win that game. Played some good footy at parts this year, especially in the tail end. Lots of scrutiny on Ken Hinkley again. It was just a classic Port Adelaide season for me. So I think as expected. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a tough one because they're a victim of their own expectations there. They've made like 4 prelims under Hinkley now, so now we don't give them the credit. So I'd probably be a little bit more generous on Port. They were diabolical in that first final, but at the end of the day, they made it to the final 4 teams of the competition, which makes them a genuine contender, even if it didn't feel like it. I would probably go very good for Port Adelaide. It doesn't feel very positive because of that final, but I think if you make it to the final 4 teams, you've definitely done your job. And therefore, I'd say very good.
Yeah, what about that home qualifier, though? They could have been playing a home prelim and they didn't show up. I don't think you can dish that shit up in a home qualifier and say, oh, yeah, we had a very good season. Because the last home game, they had that win against Hawthorn, but that was like a grand final to them. Yeah, I don't know. Port fans, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm going to put them in as expected. I'm tired.
Yeah, like I said, I think they earned their way to the Final Four, and then beating Hawthorn, even if it was at home, Port were missing a few players. I suppose Hawthorn might have been as well, but I think you give them some credit for that. I'll say very good. Definitely not exceptional.
Chuck them in very good. I'm sort of a bit hesitant to do that,
your video,
but sure.
So you can do what you want.
Which leaves us with the GWS Giants, who started the year premiership favourites out of the blocks for me. The football that they were playing early in the season was phenomenal. Went into some really poor form in the middle of the season, but came home strong to finish in the top 4. And then went out in straight sets. Last season, played in a prelim, pushed the Pies right to the line. This year, going out in straight sets. What are you saying about the Giants?
This was the single hardest one, I think, to be honest. And I suppose the similarities to Port, they didn't get to the Final Four. Look, the contrast last year they finished 7th, but were one of the best teams in the comp and nearly beat Collingwood in the prelim. They lost that by 1 point. Great final side. This year, they do the home and away part right. They get their double chance and then lose to the 2 eventual grand finalists. It's positive for them that they were in winning positions in both games. 7 goals up against one, 5 goals up against the other, and lost. So it's a real, coulda, shoulda, woulda sort of season for the Giants. Do you go very good? I don't think you can say exceptional for straight sets. As expected or very good. What are you leaning towards?
Well, I just look at where they were last year. They were playing in a prelim. The football that they played this year was very good. If you had have said to me that the Giants would get eliminated in the second week of finals, it'd probably be as expected, I think, that ballpark.
They got a week further last year, so in a sense they regressed, if that makes sense. They so could have easily been premiers, man. The Lions game or the Sydney game goes different. They could have won the whole thing.
A big chance gone begging for the Giants, but they are going to sit in as expected There's the 18 teams, Jesse. We've got the Lions and Hawks having exceptional years. The Cats, Swans, and Port having very good years. The Dockers, Dons, Giants, Suns, Bulldogs, and North. As expected, I think is fair to say. Stinky goes to Carlton, Crows, Eagles, Collingwood, and the Saints.
Go Eagles!
With Richmond and Melbourne having disastrous seasons. I think that is a fair summary. You guys get in the comments and have your say below. Give us your tier list down there. Thank you for joining me, Jesse. Any parting words?
Guys, let us know what you thought of this video in the comments section. Tell us if it was exceptional, very good, as expected, stinky, or disaster.
That's gold. Yeah, do that. Please do that. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care. You plonkers.
Goodbye.